Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And this is episode 10 of the Proactive Security Podcast. We got a couple of special guests with us today, and I'll introduce them real quick. We have Dr. Nathan Meehan and Mr. Peter Forth, both from Second Sight Training Systems. Dr. Meehan is the Director of Research and Development for Second Sight. Pete is the Director of Operations for Second Sight. Both of them are going to talk to us a little bit today about active threat assessment. So real quick, Nathan, Pete, can you guys just introduce yourselves real quick in Second Sight and what you guys do over there at Second Sight?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start that up, Mike. So Nathan Meehan, I have a PhD in criminal justice, and I'm kind of what I like to call an applied criminologist. I've done a bunch of research projects in the intersection of defense, security, and criminal justice stuff, ranging from interview and interrogation to technology development to looking at the impact of COVID on first responders. In particular, at Second Sight, I run a variety of research projects for Second Sight, and we do online course development, that kind of thing. And what we're here to talk about today is going to be the active threat assessment component of the business. And that all comes from a DoD research project that started about 10 years ago, and I'd be happy to get into that later if it would be useful. Bit more background about me. I was a DoD researcher for 6 years and set up and ran a crime analysis and intelligence unit before that while I was getting my PhD. Pete, over to you.
I am more of the practitioner side of the business. I've been in law enforcement for almost the last 30 years. I've worked in everything law enforcement. I started in patrol for my first 5 or 6 years on the job. I got promoted to sergeant after 5 or 6 years. Stayed in the patrol division for a couple of years. I went into narcotics for a few years and then ended my law enforcement career with a city police department as a detective sergeant in a major crime squad, where we handled every felony level investigation from a larceny up to a homicide. I have always been very involved in training throughout my career. I started as a trainer with my department with about 5 or 6 years on, and obviously still continue training today. Training is a passion of mine. Love to transfer my experience and constantly learn new things and transfer it over. Nate and I met at the police department I worked at when he set up the crime analysis unit way back when. So that's when our relationship started. And he used to tap into me and guys like me to say, hey, this is what I'm looking to do. Where do I find help? So that's where our relationship started. As I said, in law enforcement, I did a lot of stuff. I was on our SWAT team, our tactical team, for about 10 years. I was the commander of our sniper unit for the last 2 years on the SWAT team. But training, my one steady thing throughout my career has always been training. As a director of operations, I am, able to talk shop with folks in the police security field. I'm always able to bring things back. One thing someone taught me a long time ago, when it comes to talking about training and tactics and everything else, the only thing that ever comes out of these conversations is better tactics and training. So love to talk about it. Love to meet people. Love to continue to train always. And that's what our training is. And we'll talk about that more. Was we brought in a lot of Nate's initial research project brought in a lot of really smart people from around the country that were really good at what they did, and we harnessed it. And that's how Second Sight was born.
Well, that's awesome. And I appreciate that introduction from both of you. And I'm excited to get the chance to talk to you. I'll tell you, and Brine and I have talked about this in the past, and I've talked about this with other security leaders in the healthcare field. Threat assessment is something we have to get better at. And it's a have to. I think it's an imperative as we move forward, just given the nature of our security landscape, the threat landscape around our various hospitals and the facilities that we work to protect. And I think if we really want to truly, tap into a proactive posture when it comes to security, then threat assessment across all domains is something we have to get better at. But let's talk about what active threat assessment is. So can you guys explain to our listeners what we're talking about when we say active threat assessment?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll jump in and start off that description. And Pete, you can fill in the gaps and make it a little bit more applied and practical. So active threat assessment is an observation process that focuses on that observer, whether it's a law enforcement officer, a security professional, military personnel, wherever that they use, wherever they are at the time. And so it's a systematic observation process that starts with assessing what we call a pattern of a baseline or a pattern of consistent behavior, where you look at the place where you are and you break down what are people generally doing, how are they looking, how are they walking, what are they carrying. And you assess that pattern of consistent behavior. And then from that pattern of consistent behavior, we're able to identify what we call behavioral deviations. And these deviations are things that are contrary to that pattern of consistent behavior, right? There's something that might not necessarily look right. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that that deviation is a bad thing. People do all kinds of different stuff all the time. They might be wearing clothing that doesn't fit. They might be doing a lot of things, and a deviation doesn't imply a threat. But what that baseline and those deviations, they lead us to people who are standing out, and they lead us to folks that can be watched further to figure out, well, is this person something? Can I figure out who they are, why they're there, and what they're doing? And so, based on that, if I can figure out that they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, and I can't figure out why they're in the location, they become kind of what we call a person of interest, right? So this person of interest is identified through that process of what is the pattern of consistent behavior around, what are most people doing, how are people behaving differently, and is this different type of behavior something that I need to be concerned about? And that next step is, after we've got that person, just because they're identified as that potential POI, right, doesn't necessarily mean they are a threat, doesn't mean necessarily that they're anything that I can do about it at the time, or that's within my mission, right? Because each of us has a different job at a location. So that next step is what we call an assessment of threat indicators. And these are visual or verbal behaviors that imply somebody is conducting surveillance, carrying concealed weapons, or might be preparing for an attack. And it's a kind of a combination or a cluster of these behaviors that will lead you to determine, okay, what should I do with this person next? And so it's sort of like that entire active threat assessment process is that systematic assessment of behavior, identification of deviations, along with the roles and objectives of who's deviating, identifying that person or identifying that person, assessing them further, dismissing them maybe if it's just innocuous, or targeting them for further observation, or perhaps an interdiction. So it's kind of that whole span of imagine I'm standing at a location. Let's say it could be a mall, could be a crowded street. I have a job of trying to figure out who's there, protect people. It's my assessment process to figure out what's happening around me and pick out who I need to be concerned about. Pete, did I miss anything?
No. I mean, the initial part of our training, it basically formalizes the observation process. What we found is everyone's observation skills were very different. And what the first part of this does is just breaks that down. Some people are very good at it. Some people were not. And we found if we put this into a process to be able to look for the certain norms of behavior that we saw, the deviations became that much more obvious. But in a nutshell, that nails exactly what the short course of what our training does.
I think the thing the active threat assessment process is not necessarily a quote unquote a new methodology. It's not like Nate came up with this in a lab somewhere and he said, hey, we should do this. We took the approaches that experienced men and women, law enforcement officers for throughout the country use in their daily work process, how they observe, what they look for. And we systematized it and we articulated it enough so it's easily transferred to other folks. And so as part of that active threat assessment methodology, we have all these materials, these systems, processes, guides, documentation that helps people lead through that process so that everything is articulatable, reportable, understandable, and systematic. And so it's not a new thing that we're asking folks to do. It's probably something that Brine and Mike, you all do inside your head. All we've done is created a process around it and kind of force some steps which help people be more systematic and help it be done quicker and more efficient.
If you're interested in gaining access to this training, as part of our celebration of this 10th episode, we're actually going to give away some training. So listen until the end and we'll tell you how to win. Right. And in terms of the training itself, now, I don't want to speak for everybody in the public safety space, but if I'm to do a course and listen to somebody drone on a computer for a long time, it's not going to be effective for me. But you've managed to conduct the training in such a way that it's really conducive to adult learning principles and really helps drive home that. So what was kind of the thinking behind the methodology of the training?
So probably the best point to start, we've got a couple of different classes that we train on, and probably the one that is our best talking point is our 8-hour threat awareness program. And so that 8-hour threat awareness program is kind of the primary mechanism under which we train the active threat assessment process. And so, there is not a ton of lecture in that class. And so you have to think of it this way: the folks that we're training, our audiences are, security professionals like the men and women that work with you, law enforcement, military. They have a job of going out there and solving problems. They're not the folks that are going to want to sit back and read a ton of information, consume it and figure out how to apply it. And it was our job to develop a training process that allows people to easily be able to apply it. And so we scaffold, we start off really early in the beginning with the start of the classes is sort of very basic, and we work people up through the process while conducting practical observations. So, let's say if we broke our baselining process down into sections, right? We start off with, all right, here's a location, and the methodology can apply to any place where there's people you're making an observation. So we start off, okay, let's start off with making a systematic observation at this thing. So at any location. So we start off, I think the first area is a part of Ireland, right? So just break this down and tell us what is happening in this location. So it's all based on, we train having that our participant, our trainee is applying the methodology right from the start inside the training. So they're actually watching a location, recording what they see within our platform, getting input from the system that says, hey, here's what you should have observed, here's what you reported. And then we walk people through that process. So at the beginning, we have that scenario where watch this 4-minute scene in this area of Ireland and tell us what you see. And then by the end, you're watching a location and you're breaking down the pattern of consistent behavior. You're identifying potential persons of interest. You're flagging that one person who's a threat. And then you're focusing on them and identifying, is this person carrying a weapon? What can I think about them? What should I interdict or not? And so our training is focused on, I think, Pete, if I'm wrong about this, let me know. We have 6 practical exercises that are built into the class that all involve video-based assessments of behavior combined with 3 practical exams where you're actually applying the methodology in a scene that involves folks that are potential threats. Now, potential threat doesn't mean somebody with like a gun or a bomb or anything like that. Could be one of many things. But the idea behind our training process is we start off assuming people know nothing, right? Because people have come in from a lot of different perspectives. And then we build them up through the ability to practice routine and repeated practice of these skills all the way up to the point where they're able to apply this in a scenario and pick out that bad guy. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
What we did initially, we said initially in the beginning is, I can tell you most of the people I work in this field and that I have come across with over my years is we're all ADD. And the thought of sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours and someone talking at me or me having to read something, I would rather bounce my head off a wall for 8 hours than have to do that. So we said right from the beginning, this cannot be a class where you just have to sit down and 45 minutes into it, you're done. You're turning everything off. So the development was, it has to be interactive. You have to be able to take part in this class like you were sitting in a classroom, able to have a discussion and raise your hand and I want to talk about it. And that is with the watching the videos, the interactive videos, picking things out, constantly switching it up between reading things and then watching and being able to apply things. And the longer courses broke up into sections. There's 4 sections. The middle 2 are kind of the meat of it. And then the first section introduces you. The middle 2 sections are the meat of it. And then the last brings it all together. But everything is like Nate said, you're able to apply it and practice it as you're using it. Unlike a lot of other online classes that I've had to take. And we said that right off the bat. There's a lot of material going in here. We just can't throw it at someone or we're going to lose them. So it's put together as, here, we're going to teach you a little bit. Now try it. We're going to teach you a little, we're going to add on to that. Now try it. We're going to add this, and this. Now try it. It's the crawl, walk, run is very much the way this class was designed and built, as to not lose people, as to be able to get into this class and almost it's a class, so I don't know how much people maybe enjoy it, but be able to get the most out of it as they're going through it.
I appreciate that honesty about classwork and coursework in general. I like, I think, this is one of the things that's interesting to me. So, I think sometimes people get a little lost in the term threat assessment, and we get hyper focused on developing policies and procedures and deep investigative processes and engaging in protective intelligence work. And we forget about threat assessment beginning at the very baseline with our frontline officer, whether they're, a police officer or a security officer or whatever the context is. Threat assessment really begins with their ability to effectively assess the environment that we're asking them to protect, right? And so, one of the things I'd be interested in, and Pete, you may be able to speak to this, just given the tremendous experience you have in the law enforcement community, is I'm a security leader and trying to develop my security force to work effectively in every environment that I plug them into. And in healthcare, and specifically, you have just a wide variety of context, whether it's, an emergency department, an intensive care unit, an outpatient surgery center, a physician's office, et cetera. You've got all these different contexts that we're working in. What are the practical benefits of being able to give a systematic threat assessment approach to that frontline officer, and how does that enhance my overall security posture?
This active threat assessment, any threat assessment, is another tool. When it comes to threat assessment, there's the human factor that we can't automate. We can't say, sending someone through a metal detector does so much. Someone's observation and personal experience go a very, very long way. And you have people that are really, really good at picking out certain characteristics of people. As Nate mentioned before, we teach people to look for certain clusters of behavior that make us think that someone's actions may lead to a certain way. Getting back to what you said, the biggest thing that I hope that someone could get out of our training would be able to avoid a potentially dangerous or violent situation, be able to see it coming, being able to apply our techniques to look into a waiting room, for example, someplace, and see that person who's becoming agitated, to understand what that person's actions may mean based on what everybody else is doing, so that the next step of de-escalation, for example, can be used to calm somebody down because we're able to see it coming. Our observation process allows you to see things escalate, allows you to pick out that person that you should be looking at when we're looking at the going from the masses to the few, to be able to concentrate on the few that we could go in, okay, hey, we may have a problem here. I made additional resources to hand these problems, and that's what threat assessment does for you. I think that the ultimate end result of threat assessment would be to be able to de-escalate and stop a situation before it happens. That's probably one of the biggest thing of our training, of which we're to lower use of force incidents, to identify individuals before they may become violent or before they may become a problem. And without realizing it, because I would say I'm good at this now after a while, and just it was my years of experience that made me good. Everyone's not. Everyone isn't. We'd all be looking at someone. And another example, I'm sure when all of us walk into a restaurant, what's the first thing we do when we get there? We stop, we look around, we look for exits, we look to see where I want to sit at the table. When I walk in now, the rest of my family walks in and says, where are you going to sit? So I could have the seat where I can see everything, because that's what I'm doing. I'm assessing threat in every, as soon as I walk out of my house, I start assessing threat. And it's so important to keep, and we're in the business of keeping other people safe, but to keep ourselves safe and to keep everybody else safe is to be able to predict outcomes. And that's what that's what threat assessment does. Another big part of what we do as protecting ourselves when it comes to threat assessment, we become better at articulation. When somebody picks up a radio and I'm able to say, hey, Mike, I'm going to need some assistance down here because I have a person, I think is getting ready to fight because they're doing A, B, C, and D. Or when you do have a use of force incident and have to come back and put it on paper, they better articulate why they had to take the actions that they had by educating people in the threat assessment. This was the norm here. This is how this person was acted. This is what this escalated to, and this is what I had to do. So there's so many different pieces of the threat assessment part of the proactive threat assessment, the articulation of threat assessment, And again, being able to cut down certain incidents by being able to avoid them because you saw it coming.
Just wanted to, if you don't mind, just wanted to add something to that. And this is that communication component that Pete mentioned in that articulation. So, I'm not necessarily sure what the situation is with your teams, Mike and Brine, but a lot of folks are coming into security with a lot of different types of experience. You might have current and former law enforcement, you might have military, you might have civilian folks without those kind of backgrounds like me. And so through the active threat assessment methodology, we establish a common terminology that applies to everything that you see, applies to a process, applies to clusters of behavior. So that means that, teams can communicate using the same language and have the same understanding of what the terminology that's applied. So, if you think about if one of your security camera people, your observers are watching, I think this person has a gun. Right. If they can relay that to the security team or whoever has to interdict about the specific behaviors, why this person is doing A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and your team can know exactly what A, B, C, D, E, F, and G means, they can approach that in a much safer manner. While if you had to describe each one of these entire behaviors, what they mean during that communication, it's going to take a lot longer and it might be ineffective. So we can establish that shared understanding of what that threat looks like, and it kind of helps communication. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, one of the things that's interesting to me as I listen to you guys describe this, and even from, taking some of the training myself, one of the things that you talk about in the training is, as a benefit, is it helps to reduce subjectivity in your observations, right? And, one of the concerns we always hear is we don't want our officers to be too subjective. We want them to be, as objective as possible as they apply principles like this across their particular area of interest or area of concern. And so, when I hear you talk about building that common language, what I hear you talking about is helping to reduce that subjectivity.
It also, Mike, I'll use the word that no one used to be able to say before, especially in law enforcement: profile. You'd say profile and everyone would go, what are you talking about? You can't say that. You can't think that. What we do is, and I don't mind saying, and I'm actually proud to say, we're profiling behavior. That's what threat assessment is. It has nothing to do with race, gender, ethnicity. It has to do with behavior. We teach you to look at the norm of an area at a time. And then when certain actions or behaviors make us take a look at it for a different reason, it is the behavior that made us look, not any of those other things that used to be thought of as with the profiling word. We profile behavior, and that's huge with threat assessment. And everything is taken into context. That's the idea of a baseline. Is we want you to be able to, you could baseline anywhere. You could be anywhere in the world, in any type of circumstance that you potentially could be in. And there is a pattern of consistent behavior in that area. And that's what we're teaching people to look for.
And I think, the whole subjectivity and, the profiling component, a lot of profiling, as it's described as the dirty word, is kind of race-based profiling, where you're profiling based on a single non-controllable factor like race. And what we're describing here is we're talking about building up a behavioral profile of a place and the individuals who are in it, which allows you not only to identify what shouldn't be there, but also to better dismiss and more clearly dismiss and say, I don't need to be concerned about this person. And in some of the research that we've done, we talk about that tied to our methodology, we see increases in dismissal rates. And so what we mean by that is, let's say you're given a battery of 6 individuals that you're watching. Before people take the training, they might say 4 or 5 of these people are people that I need to keep watching, that are really suspicious, that they're deviating a lot, and I got to be concerned about them, right? And at the end of the training, they're looking at 1 or 2, right? So which is what they should be looking at. So we're able to help people ignore the things they shouldn't be concerned about, focus on the things they should be concerned about, but also not key in on the thing that looks different right off the bat, but that the baseline process brings them into the point where, like, okay, now I know what my pattern of consistent behavior is. I can pick out what I should clearly be concerned about, and also explain to anybody why I made that decision. So because literally we have as part of our training, we have a behavioral baseline instrument, BBI. I wish I had it with me, but it's a document that you fill out. It's actually a training tool, but you complete it as you're making your observation. So you have your pattern of consistent behavior on there, and you can record your deviations on there. And so you actually have here's what was going on in this location. Here's what led me to this person. Here's what they were doing. Here's the threat indicators that I saw. This is why I took this action. And so it protects against those accusations that, oh, why did I stop this person? He looks suspicious, right? Well, it helps to articulate what that suspicion is, but also helps to explain justifiable actions, and also helps because we can't always assume we can't always assume that people focusing on somebody who's not a threat is malicious. Sometimes they really think that person is a threat, that they're just not sure how to figure that out. And this process helps them get to pick out that real threat rather than thinking things are threatening that actually aren't. Did that make sense? Did I explain that the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially it's giving proper context in terms of the actual officer conducting the assessment, and later on as well for the purposes of their articulation.
Exactly. And Pete, you can kind of jump in on this is the observation is only applicable to the person who's doing that observation at the location. That it's not like I have this document and I can give it to somebody 3 days later who can use that and think the same thing will apply. So it really has to be tied to that individual's observations. Pete, any further thoughts?
No, it definitely, we mentioned the subjectivity part of it, the articulation part of it, but no, I think that's fine.
When we, the subjectivity part, this comes up in our training a lot, especially with online training, as we have to provide correct and incorrect answers in some of our systems. When in our instructor-led classes, we can talk about, we'll look at a scene, we'll break down behavior. There are going to be some variation in what people perceive as a fast gait or a slow gait, or how situationally aware are people. There's always going to be some subjectivity. In our online classes, we actually have to, how do I describe it? Articulate exact correct and incorrect answers. And so we do get pushback from folks occasionally. And this was something that was brought up when we beta tested the training, was we needed to allow more room for that subjectivity, meaning that like we might have some variation in answers, but that's okay as long as that your subjectivity is reduced through this process and it leads you to the same place. Right. So kind of like, and the way we describe it, and Pete does this really well, is the baseline is really your base, right? Like it's your assessment. So what you assess as, fast walking, people's activities, that kind of thing, that the main thing is your process, the baseline that you assess leads you to picking out that person or knowing what's happening around you. There might be variation if Brian and Mike, both of you guys were looking at the same place, applying our methodology, using our behavioral baseline instrument. You're going to have some variation. But if you can pick out that guy with the gun, right, who might be a threat, then that variation doesn't really matter that much.
It's like doing math with your kids, and they came home and they tell you, you have to do it this way. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means, but we both came up with the same answer. It's a lot like that. It is the human factors. We see things through our own eyes. As long as you consistently base it off of how you are looking at something, the end result is 90% of the time, 95% of the time, and what we found is going to be the same. So we may look at things a little bit differently, but in the end, it's as long as we're basing everything off that same pattern of consistent behavior, the way we see it, then we're going to get to the same end result. It's the human factor. I look at the world a little bit, each of us look at the world a little bit differently than the person next to us. When teaching classes in law enforcement, I always say everyone brings a different human experience to the table. So if you grew up in the country and you walked into somebody's house and there was a shotgun next to the front door, it means something very different than growing up in an urban environment and you walk into somebody's house and there's a shotgun next to the front door. Means very, very different things. So we see the world in different ways. Everyone sees the world in different ways. And it's okay and that's the biggest part of subjectivity with us is it's okay. We expect people to see it in different ways, but like going back to the kids with math, we're going to come up with the same answer, but how we got there, the way we looked at it from A to Z, maybe a little bit differently, but end result is we're going to people are seeing what the situation is showing them. People, we're seeing the same thing at the end.
I think ultimately that's what gives this opportunity, especially in the healthcare environment, because as I mentioned earlier, we have such a wide array of environments that have the need for different levels of baseline, right? And one of the things that's interesting to me in the security field, just in general, is, and this is something I tell my officers all the time, is we always have home field advantage. So we get the opportunity to establish that baseline over very long periods of time. We know what it's supposed to look and feel like in the waiting room of our emergency department, or we know what it's supposed to look like and feel like, in the, community clinic that we work at, or whatever the environment is that we're in. And being able to effectively articulate and build off of that baseline and understanding of those deviations, I think really helps us enhance that, continuous readiness. And to your earlier point, Pete, the opportunity to interdict potential threats before they manifest into actual violence, which I think is an excellent opportunity, especially when we can apply that with effective de-escalation.
You bring up a really good point, of which when we taught this, our first few times of teaching this class, we brought in some really experienced people. And what somebody said to us, and we've applied it to the rest of our training as we went on, is, I work in the same area all the time. I know what's right. I know what looks right. I know what doesn't look right. Just like you said, what your emergency room, waiting room is supposed to look like. You know what these areas look like. He said, what I always do, he goes, what this makes me do now, this process makes me do now, is I'm paying much more attention to the norm. So when and especially when it comes to explaining what happened or seeing what happened, people don't get what the norm is like I get what the norm is, because I see this every day. So when I can explain to somebody else, here is what the waiting room, there's upset people, there's, and knowing what the norm is, there's a lot better understanding and that much faster when there are deviations, when something is wrong. So a couple of these guys said, this really made me pay attention to what I usually didn't pay attention to. I would just immediately look for deviations without taking a second to look at what the norm is, what that pattern of behavior is at the time, before I would make action on something else. And said, I'm really paying attention to the norm now, as opposed to just jumping immediately and looking at something. I look at the big picture as opposed to immediately look at what I think just doesn't look right at the time.
If you don't mind, Mike and Brine and Pete, I'd like to kind of spin back the conversation a little bit to talk about that de-escalation and that dealing with that potentially threatening individual. And this is kind of one of the ways I started to think about it. It's not only identifying that threat and how threatening that person is, but being able to make a true assessment of what level of threat that individual is, so I don't have to escalate it. Or I, as the person who's dealing with that person, doesn't make the situation worse because I've read that person wrong. So somebody can be angry and agitated, and I speak at this purely from a theoretical standpoint. I haven't really dealt with this personally, but may not be showing any signs that they're going to attack, that they're a threat. They might not be preparing to attack. And if the observer is not able to separate this person's upset from this person might attack me, they might combine those two together and then escalate that situation, or use what they would consider preventative action because they thought that person was a threat. This allows them to say, this person's upset, but I don't see that they're going to immediately take action that I need to head off. So I don't need to react in a disproportionate way. And it's that dual benefit, right? It allows you to react ahead of time if somebody is a threat, but also not react if the person is not a threat. I'm not sure if that makes. Pete, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, ultimately, the idea of this is to be able to de-escalate a situation before it happens. So yes, it works in both ways. We've seen it. I've worked with and know a lot of people who could start a riot in a phone booth. They could get in there and they say the absolute wrong thing. They do the absolute wrong thing. They posture up on someone and escalates everything. If we could see a situation, which this does, you could take a look at this and say, all right, this person is from the bigger situation, from where I am, from me making this person is upset, not violent. This person is violent, so perhaps I need to bring more resources so that this person realizes, I can better tactically plan. That's what a good observation plan allows you to do. You could come up with a better plan on how to deal with the situation for what it really is, as opposed to either escalate it, being able to de-escalate something based on what you're seeing. So yes, it's reading people. It's allowing people to understand what they're seeing. We teach a lot of, pre-fight or fight and flight posture. What does someone look like? What's it mean to us? I could describe to you or stand here and you see my hands clench up. You see the veins in my neck starting to bulge, my head getting red. I'm starting to pace. Things are like, there's certain things that we read. We can say, as things get there, I need to de-escalate situations like this. So ultimately, the idea of this is to be able to use this observation process to never get to that next point.
And I think that has tremendous potential in a healthcare environment, because you're going to have, just as part of the baseline, stressed out, upset, emotional people. I mean, most people don't end up in the emergency department because they're having a good day. And so, when you look at the context of that environment, the ability to your point, not escalate the situation further has tremendous value, especially when you're trying to bring down the temperature of a room that's already going to be high as a part of its baseline. I think, to your point, Pete, what you were saying, I've known several people who could talk you into a fight any day of the week, and you never want to bring them, to that de-escalation point, because they're not going to be helpful in that regard. And it's our ability to help de-escalate the temperature that really allows us to provide true value to the organizations we serve, to the people we're trying to protect.
You bring up a really good point about, like you said, people don't come to an emergency room because they had a good day. Part of our baseline, when you walk into the emergency room, you expect to see people that are upset. You expect to see people that are concerned. When you see that person jumping around in a corner, happy as can be, and that may become your person of interest. That's outside you. A baseline could be anything. A baseline doesn't have to be people are acting the way we think someone's supposed to act. The baseline is what is normal in that situation. So it's not always that person, like I described, with their fists and their veins pumping and they're all red. That could be normal. That could be a normal baseline in certain areas. So going outside of that to say, okay, now I'm walking into a place, an emergency room, waiting room, and I see this person jumping around, happy as can be, and that could be my threat. That's my POI. That is someone who's rapidly changing for a reason that I don't understand, and that may be someone I have to keep an eye on. So you bring up just a very good example of how a baseline works. And how you guys see it, and just you would be far better at walking into a emergency room, waiting room, and in 30 seconds realizing we got to keep an eye on that guy in the corner, than me, who would walk in and have to spend a little time understanding what the norm is for this area at this time.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, Mike, that you mentioned is that idea of a home field advantage, right? You have an idea about what it should look like, but we also have, I'm sure, you also have staff that are rotated through and working in different places at different times. And so there's folks that might be not as familiar with that location. And, what another benefit is that this can help them get familiar with that location much more quickly than having to spend a week or 2 weeks there, is that they can, hey, this is a new place. Let me start assessing my baseline. Let me see what's going on here. And they're going to be able to build up that situational awareness at that new place much more quickly than they otherwise would have.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And, one of the things that I find truly beneficial in just the training that I've taken from what you guys have provided is that ability to kind of ramp an individual from zero to capable fairly quickly. And, we've already mentioned you get people from all over the spectrum, different experiences, different backgrounds, different trainings, and being able to provide, them that capacity, giving them a baseline to speak from, right? When we're dealing with the active threat assessment, that helps really ramp that individual's capability to provide value within the context of your program so much faster, which I really think is a true benefit.
Well, that's great. I think that, it's the hard part about this entire process is that it takes time to build up that skill level. It takes a time, and we've taken that active threat assessment methodology and trained it in an 8-hour class, but it's a pretty intense 8-hour class. There's a lot of stuff that's involved in that, a lot of practice, a lot of effort, but folks really like it when they get out the other side. And the other benefit is the fact that, look, you get to apply those skills right away, right? It's not like, hey, I'm going to learn about this theoretical concept and I'm not quite sure how to apply it, or might not have the opportunity to apply it for a couple months. You can apply it while you're in the training, right after the training. Like it's literally right there in front of you. And you can kind of apply it right away.
Awesome. Now, if anybody wants to learn more, where can people find you?
Sure. That's a great question. Check out our website, www.secondsight-ts.com. We've got a lot of information on our different training classes. We also have a free introductory online course for anybody who wants to learn more about what active threat assessment looked like, whether it's a good fit for them. It's an opportunity to learn more about our, how we approach training and our approach. So that's available. You can click right on our website, go to courses, and you'll see that right at the top if you want to take that free training. We also have a lot of blogs about our methodology. There's just a lot of information that's on the web there that's available, as well as this podcast. So this is a good way to learn more about it as well. Pete, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I could. I'll also send you an email with Nate's address. He always has cold beer. And if anyone wants to talk about it, he'd love you just to stop by. He'll have a cold one with you and talk tactics. But no, that is, there's a lot of blogs out. Nate has blogged a lot about, has a bunch of different articles about how we apply our training. There's a lot of information out there to learn a lot more about us.
No, that's great. We really appreciate it. I was just going to say, Pete, Nathan, we really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this with us. I think there's some tremendous value in what you're doing and what you're bringing to the table for folks like us who are trying to do a better job of protecting people in a world that's getting a little more dangerous every day. And we see those articles and news stories coming out across the board with, increases in violent attacks and aggravated assaults and, homicides, and nobody is immune to the levels of stress in our environment. And if there's stress outside the hospital, I guarantee you there's stress inside the hospital. And anything that we see outside, we see manifested inside. And so we appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Yeah.
Yes, definitely our pleasure. And I wish you guys the best of luck. Thank you for bringing attention to, I know I've worked with a few hospitals lately and they're training their security staff. And they said there just really isn't a lot of good training out there for you folks. So I wish you guys the best of luck in finding it. I hope we're helping fill a little bit of that void. But good luck. Keep up the work. Keep looking for it. There's definitely some good training out there. Unfortunately, you got to dig a little bit deeper sometimes to find it. But I wish you guys the best of luck in finding it. And thanks for doing this. Thanks for bringing attention to what we have to offer. It will definitely keep you a little bit safer. It'll keep the people you're trying to keep safe a little bit safer. And thanks for talking to us about it.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. And I hope everybody listening got as much value out of this as we did. We're at the end of the show. And as promised, we're going to tell you how to win access to this training. So it's pretty straightforward. If you could comment on the post on LinkedIn and just express your interest on there, we'll pick a winner and we'll get you connected with Nate and Pete and get the training set up for you. So just comment on the LinkedIn post. The easiest way to find this post, if you didn't listen directly from the link, is to just visit the Proactive Security company page on LinkedIn, and it will be the most recent post. Thanks again, and until next time, stay proactive.